Picture this. You're walking through the royal court of 13th century England, past marble floors and silk banners, when you witness something that makes your blood run cold. The kingdom's most celebrated knight, the warrior who saved England from certain destruction, the hero whose sword arm was legend throughout the realm, stands before the king. But as they remove their helmet, long hair spills across their shoulders, and the terrible truth that will shake the very foundations of medieval society is finally revealed. What you're about to hear is not a fairy tale. This is the true story documented in one of history's most shocking manuscripts. A tale so controversial it was buried for centuries, dismissed as unimportant documents until its accidental rediscovery in 1911. It's the story of Silence, a knight whose secret was so dangerous that revealing it could mean death, whose courage was so extraordinary that they fooled an entire kingdom, and whose quest for identity would challenge everything medieval society believed about gender, honor, and what it truly means to be a hero. But before we dive into this remarkable journey, I need you to do something for me. If this story intrigues you, if you're curious about these hidden corners of history that textbooks never taught you, hit that subscribe button and comment below to let me know where you're listening from. Because we are about to explore one of the most fascinating and suppressed stories from the Middle Ages. And I want to know if tales like this resonate with you as much as they do with me. In the year 1200, in the windswept realm of Cornwall, Count Cador faced the most devastating decision of his life. His wife, Euphemie, had just given birth to their first child, a daughter. In any other time, in any other place, this would have been cause for celebration. Instead, it was a catastrophe. You see, 3 years earlier, the King of England had issued a decree that would change everything. No woman could inherit land, titles, or wealth. Not a single acre, not a single coin, nothing. The king's reasoning was brutally simple. Women were too weak, too emotional, too easily manipulated to handle property or power. Every noble family in the kingdom now lived in terror of producing female heirs. For Cador, this wasn't just a political problem. It was an existential crisis. He was the Count of Cornwall, one of the most powerful men in England. His family had held these lands for generations, building their legacy stone by stone, battle by battle. Everything he had fought for, everything his ancestors had died for, would be lost forever if he had no male heir to pass it to. And yet, here he stood, cradling his newborn daughter, feeling her tiny fingers wrap around his thumb with surprising strength. How could something so perfect be considered so worthless by law? Euphemie, still pale from childbirth, looked up at her husband with fierce determination burning in her eyes. "What if?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "What if we don't tell them?" Cador stared at her. "What do you mean? What if we say we had a son?" The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, the wind howled across the Cornish moors, as if the very elements understood the magnitude of what was being proposed. Cador's mind raced through the implications. This wasn't just lying to neighbors or friends. This would mean deceiving the king himself. The punishment for such deception would be swift and merciless. But what choice did they have? Watch their bloodline end? See their lands seized by the crown? let everything they'd built crumble to dust. Kador looked down at his daughter again. Even as a newborn, there was something extraordinary about her. Something in her eyes suggested she would grow up to be remarkable if she was given the chance. We'll need to be perfect, he said slowly. One mistake, one person who suspects the truth, and we're all dead. Ufemi nodded grimly. Then we'll be perfect. And so began the most elaborate deceptions in medieval history. They named the child Silence, a name that could belong to either a boy or a girl, but whose deeper meaning would prove prophetic. For this child would spend their entire life learning when to speak and when to remain silent, when to reveal truth and when to hide it. But here's what makes this story so extraordinary. This wasn't just about inheritance laws or family politics. What Kador and Ufemi couldn't have known is that they were about to raise one of the greatest knights who ever lived. Their daughter would become so skilled with the sword, so brave in battle, so noble in character, that she would save the kingdom itself. The question that would haunt Silence's entire life was this: if you become the perfect man, if you live as a man, fight as a man, think as a man, what does that make you? For the first few years, the deception was manageable. Toddlers looked like toddlers, regardless of gender. Silence played with wooden swords, learned to ride ponies, and called their father "my lord," just like any noble son would. But as Silence grew older, the challenges multiplied. Every aspect of their upbringing had to be carefully orchestrated. Where most noble children learned from tutors and servants, Silence was raised in near isolation, with only their parents and a handful of trusted retainers who knew the truth. Kador personally taught them swordplay, explaining how a knight must stand, how to thrust and parry, how to read an opponent's movements. Ufemi, meanwhile, taught them the political arts, how to speak with authority, how to command respect, how to navigate the treacherous waters of court life. Silence was a quick learner, frighteningly quick. By age 8, they could already outfight boys twice their age. By 10, they could compose music and poetry with such skill that traveling minstrels wept to hear it. By 12, they had grown into someone who commanded attention the moment they entered a room. But adolescence was approaching, and with it, the crisis that could destroy everything. Silence's body was beginning to change, and no amount of training could alter basic biology. Late at night, alone in their chamber, Silence would stare at their reflection in the polished metal mirror, watching their face grow softer. Their body developed curves that would soon become impossible to hide. The solution came from Kador's military experience. Knights wore layers of padding beneath their armor, thick cloth gambesons that protected them from the chafing of metal plates. With careful tailoring, these undergarments could disguise any body shape. Loose tunics, strategic binding, and the bulky nature of medieval clothing would do the rest. But the physical challenges were nothing compared to the psychological ones. Because around this time, something extraordinary began happening to Silence. They started having conversations with forces that seemed almost supernatural, personifications of nature and nurture that appeared in their dreams and waking visions. Nature appearing as a beautiful woman surrounded by flowers and flowing water would whisper, "You are deceiving yourself, child. You were born female, and female you shall always be. Stop this madness and embrace your true nature before it's too late." But nurture, manifesting as a stern figure in scholar's robes, would counter, "You have been raised as a knight, trained as a warrior, educated as a leader. Your deeds and accomplishments define you, not the body you were born into. You are who you choose to become." These weren't just philosophical debates. They were agonizing internal struggles that kept silence awake at night. Who was right? What was truth? Was their identity determined by their body or by their actions and achievements? What's remarkable about these medieval accounts is how sophisticated they are in their understanding of identity. This wasn't a simple story of cross-dressing for practical purposes. The author, known only as Heldris of Cornwall, seemed to understand something profound about the relationship between gender, society, and personal identity, concepts we are still grappling with today. By age 15, Silence had grown into someone extraordinary, tall and athletic, with the bearing of nobility and the skills of a master knight. They had become everything their parents had hoped for. But they had also become something neither parent anticipated. A young person wrestling with questions of identity that had no easy answers. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If anyone discovered the truth, Silence would face not just social disgrace, but likely execution for fraud. Their parents would be destroyed, their lands confiscated, their family name erased from history. And yet, despite all the danger, despite all the secrecy, Silence was beginning to realize something that would change everything. They didn't want to be anything other than who they had become. The thought of living as a woman, confined to the limited roles medieval society allowed females, felt like a death sentence. They were a knight. In every way that mattered, they were a man. But soon, they would have to prove it to the world. At 16, Silence faced the first real test of their masculine identity, and it came from the most unexpected source. A troupe of traveling minstrels had arrived at Cador's court, bringing with them songs, stories, and dreams of adventure that ignited something wild in Silence's heart. These weren't ordinary entertainers. They were the celebrities of their era, rock stars who traveled from court to court, earning gold and glory through their musical talents. Watching them perform, seeing the freedom they possessed to travel the world and craft their own destinies, Silence felt a yearning so powerful it was almost painful. Here was a life without the constant fear of discovery. Here was a chance to test their abilities against the wider world, to see if they could truly live as a man among strangers who had no reason to suspect the truth. So Silence made a decision that terrified their parents. They ran away. In the dead of night, Silence slipped from the castle, taking only the loot, a handful of gold coins, and the clothes on their back. They caught up with the minstrel troupe just as they were breaking camp and convinced them to take on an eager young apprentice named, ironically, Malduit, which means badly brought up. What followed were 4 years of the most intense education imaginable. Living rough on the roads between castles, Silence learned to survive by their wits and talents alone. They mastered dozens of musical instruments, memorized hundreds of songs and stories, and developed the kind of quick thinking that comes from having to entertain hostile audiences who might turn violent if they were bored. But more importantly, they learned to be convincingly male in ways their sheltered upbringing had never required. They learned to walk with a swagger, to tell crude jokes, to spit and scratch, and take up space in the way medieval men were expected to do. They bound their breasts so tightly that they sometimes struggled to breathe, and developed a repertoire of excuses for why their voice remained higher than most young men's. The other minstrels accepted Maldui as one of their own, never suspecting that their most talented member was living a double life. Silence became so skilled that audiences would weep at their performances, so charismatic that nobles would shower them with gold and gifts. But success bred jealousy, and jealousy bred danger. The other minstrels, resentful of being overshadowed by this young upstart, began plotting against them. Late one night, Silence overheard them planning to kill Maldui and steal their earnings. Once again, Silence found themselves forced to flee in the darkness, this time heading for the one place they never thought they'd return to: home. When they appeared at Cador's court after 4 years of absence, they were almost unrecognizable. Gone was the sheltered youth who had run away. This was a seasoned performer, worldly and confident, with calloused hands and stories that could hold an audience spellbound for hours. Their parents, who had mourned them as dead, were overjoyed. But their mother, Euphemie, was also disturbed by something she couldn't quite name. This young man, who claimed to be their son, was attractive, charismatic in a way that made her pulse quicken despite herself. Which brings us to one of the most uncomfortable aspects of this medieval story. Euphemie, not knowing the true identity of the minstrel, became attracted to what she believed was a handsome young stranger. She began making advances, trying to seduce the person she didn't realize was her own daughter. Silence found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't reveal their identity without destroying the entire deception. But they also couldn't reciprocate their mother's advances without, well, the implications were too horrible to contemplate. So they did what they had to do. They ran away again. This time, they would seek their fortune in the one place where true skill mattered more than family connections: the battlefield. The court of King Evan of England in the year 1220 was a place where reputation meant everything and failure meant death. When the young knight calling himself Silence arrived seeking service, he faced the most skeptical audience imaginable: battle-hardened warriors who could spot a pretender from across a courtyard. But Silence was no pretender. Those years on the road as a minstrel had taught them to read people, to adapt quickly to new situations, and to project confidence even in the face of mortal danger. When they demonstrated their swordplay, even the grizzled veterans were impressed. When they composed songs celebrating the king's victories, even the court poets admitted defeat. King Evan, a shrewd judge of character, recognized something special in this young knight. Here was someone with the skills of a master warrior, but without the arrogance that usually came with such talent. Someone loyal, intelligent, and seemingly without personal ambition beyond serving the crown. What the king didn't know was that Silence's humility came from a very practical source. They couldn't afford to draw too much attention to themselves. Every day at court was a careful balancing act between demonstrating their abilities and avoiding the kind of scrutiny that might reveal their secret. The first real test came when raiders from Scotland began terrorizing the northern borders. King Evan assembled his finest knights for a campaign that would either crush the invaders or die in the attempt. Silence volunteered immediately, knowing that military service would either prove their worth once and for all or end their deception permanently. What happened next would be talked about for generations. The Scottish raiders weren't ordinary brigands. They were desperate men with nothing to lose. Fighting on terrain heretofore, they knew better than anyone. The English forces found themselves lured into a trap in a narrow mountain pass, surrounded by enemies and facing what looked like certain annihilation. That's when Silence stepped forward. While other knights panicked, Silence remained calm. Drawing on their years of studying military strategy with their father and their street-smart survival instincts from their time as a minstrel, they proposed a plan so audacious it bordered on madness. A nighttime assault on the Scottish camp, using their knowledge of music to coordinate the attack. Under cover of darkness, Silence led a small group of volunteers through enemy lines, using bird calls and musical phrases as signals. They struck at dawn, creating such chaos in the Scottish ranks that the main English force was able to break free from the trap and turn defeat into routing victory. King Evan was so impressed that he immediately elevated Silence to his inner circle, making them one of the most trusted knights in the kingdom. But success brought its own dangers, because it also brought them to the attention of Queen Euphemie. Yes, the same Euphemie who was Silence's mother, though neither recognized the other in this context. The queen had a different name, a different title, but she was the same woman who had once tried to seduce the minstrel Malduit. And now, seeing this young knight's prowess and charisma, she felt that same dangerous attraction stirring again. What followed was one of the most psychologically complex situations in medieval literature. Queen Euphemia began pursuing Silence romantically, not realizing she was pursuing her own child. Silence, trapped by their false identity and unable to reveal the truth, found themselves in a nightmare scenario with no good options. When Silence continued to resist the queen's advances, citing loyalty to the king and their own vows of chastity, Euphemie's attraction turned to fury. Hell hath no fury like a queen scorned, and she began plotting revenge that would either destroy Silence or force them to submit to her will. But Silence had survived too much and fought too hard to be destroyed by palace intrigue. They had become too skilled, too valuable to the kingdom, and too beloved by their fellow knights to be easily disposed of. The confrontation that would determine Silence's fate was about to begin. The accusations came without warning, delivered in the throne room before the entire court. Queen Euphemie, her face a mask of righteous indignation, pointed a trembling finger at Silence and spoke words that could mean death. This knight attempted to violate my honor. He forced his attentions upon me and would not take no for an answer. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. The penalty for such a crime was clear: immediate execution. But King Evan, who had come to trust Silence's character implicitly, found himself torn between his wife's word and his knight's reputation. Silence stood perfectly still, their mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to disaster. They could deny the charges, but it would be their word against the Queen's. They could reveal their true identity and prove the impossibility of the crime, but that would mean death for an entirely different reason. Or, "My lord," Silence said, their voice steady despite the mortal danger, "I swear upon my honor that I have never acted inappropriately toward any woman in this court. If you doubt my word, give me a chance to prove my worth to the crown through service rather than words." It was a brilliant gambit. In medieval culture, trial by ordeal or quest was considered a valid way to determine guilt or innocence. If God favored the accused, they would succeed in their task and be proven innocent. If they were guilty, they would fail and receive divine justice. King Evan, perhaps seeing a way to resolve the situation without destroying either his marriage or his best knight, agreed. But the quest he proposed was one that everyone assumed would be impossible. Bring back the wizard Merlin, who had been missing for years and was rumored to be living wild in the forests, mad with grief and rage. The court was stunned. This wasn't just a difficult quest, it was a suicide mission. Merlin, even in his madness, possessed powers that could destroy armies. Many knights had sought him over the years. None had returned. But Silence accepted without hesitation. What choice did they have? It was either face certain death in the forest or certain death at the executioner's block. As they prepared for the journey, something unexpected happened. Their fellow knights, men who had fought beside them, who had seen their courage and honor firsthand, began volunteering to join the quest. They refused to believe that their brother-in-arms could be guilty of the charges, and they were willing to risk their lives to help prove his innocence. The night before departure, Sir Gareth, one of Silence's closest friends, pulled them aside for a private conversation. "I don't know what game the Queen is playing," he said quietly, "but I know you're innocent. You're the most honorable knight I've ever served with. Whatever secrets you're carrying, and don't deny you have them, we all have secrets. They don't change who you are." Silence felt tears threatening to spill down their cheeks. If only Gareth knew how right he was about the secrets and how wrong he might be about the honor. "Promise me something," Gareth continued. "If this quest goes badly, if we don't make it back, promise me you'll tell me the truth about who you really are. I'd rather die knowing I stood beside someone real than live wondering if I ever truly knew you at all." It was a promise Silence couldn't make, but they nodded anyway. Because what was one more deception added to a lifetime of them. The next morning, as they rode out from the castle gates, Silence turned back for one last look at the life they were leaving behind. They had spent years building a reputation, earning respect, becoming someone who mattered. Now they were riding toward almost certain death, carrying secrets that would die with them in the deep woods. But they had no choice. The alternative was to live as someone they weren't, confined by rules they couldn't accept, pretending to be weak when they knew themselves to be strong. They would rather die as the man they had become than live as the woman they were expected to be. The forest of Broceliande was a place where reason went to die, ancient beyond memory, thick with mists that seemed to whisper secrets in forgotten languages. It was the kind of wilderness that swallowed armies whole and spat out only bones and legends. This was where Merlin had retreated after the fall of Camelot, where the greatest wizard in history had chosen madness over sanity, solitude over civilization. Finding him would be like searching for a specific shadow in an ocean of darkness. Silence and their companions, 5 knights who had volunteered for what everyone assumed was a suicide mission, made camp on the forest's edge as the sun began to set. The plan was simple because it had to be. Search during the day, pray during the night, and hope that divine justice really would guide them to their quarry. But as they sat around their campfire that first night, sharing what might be their last meal, Silence found themselves thinking about identity in ways they never had before. Out here, stripped of courtly pretenses and facing almost certain death, what did it matter whether they were male or female? What mattered was courage, loyalty, the willingness to sacrifice for something greater than themselves. The irony wasn't lost on them. It had taken a lifetime of deception to discover who they truly were. The first week of searching yielded nothing but frustration. The forest seemed to shift around them, paths appearing and disappearing, streams flowing uphill, clearings that looked familiar despite being seen for the first time. This wasn't natural terrain. It was a landscape shaped by magic, designed to confuse and disorient intruders. But Silence had advantages the others didn't. Their years as a minstrel had taught them to navigate by sound as much as sight, to read the subtle signs that indicated human presence even in the wildest places. More importantly, their unique perspective on identity gave them insights into Merlin's psychology that others might miss. Because Merlin, in his own way, was also living a double life. The man who had once been the wisest counselor in Christendom was now pretending to be a wild beast, hiding his true nature behind madness and isolation. He and Silence had more in common than either might realize. On the 10th day, they found the first real clue, a clearing where the grass grew in perfect geometric patterns, where flowers bloomed in colors that shouldn't exist in nature. They were getting close. The attack came at dawn on the 11th day, not from Merlin, but from something far worse. Bandits who had been following them since they entered the forest, waiting for the right moment to strike. These weren't ordinary thieves. They were desperate men who had turned to cannibalism to survive in the deep woods, and they saw the knights as their next meal. The battle was savage and brief. Silence and their companions were skilled fighters, but they were outnumbered 3-1 and caught by surprise. 2 of the knights fell in the first minutes of combat. A third was wounded so badly he couldn't continue fighting. That's when Silence did something that surprised everyone, including themselves. Instead of retreating or calling for quarter, they began to sing. It wasn't a war song or a prayer. It was one of the ancient ballads they had learned during their years as a minstrel. A song about heroes who faced impossible odds and found strength in their desperation. Their voice rang out clear and strong above the clash of steel, transforming the chaotic melee into something that felt almost ritualistic. The effect was extraordinary. Their surviving companions seemed to grow stronger, their sword strokes more precise, their movements more coordinated. Even the bandits seemed affected, their attacks growing less focused as they found themselves listening despite themselves. But the real miracle came when a new voice joined the song from somewhere deep in the forest, a voice that harmonized perfectly with silence's melody, adding layers of meaning and power that transformed the simple ballad into something approaching magic. Merlin had found them. The figure that emerged from the shadows was barely recognizable as human, let alone as the legendary Merlin. Wild hair reached past his shoulders, matted with leaves and mud. His beard was a tangle of grey and white that hadn't been trimmed in years. His clothes were little more than rags, and his feet were bare and bleeding from walking on stones and thorns. But his eyes still held the intelligence that had once guided kings and shaped the fate of nations. He had looked at the aftermath of the battle, at the dead bandits and wounded knights, and then his gaze settled on silence with an intensity that seemed to see straight through flesh and bone to the soul beneath. "You sing with the woman's heart," he said, his voice rusty from years of disuse. "But you fight with a man's courage. How fascinating." Silence felt their blood turn to ice. After years of successful deception, had this madman seen through them in seconds? But Merlin wasn't finished. "You seek me for your king's justice, but I think the real question is this: what justice do you seek for yourself?" It was such an unexpected response that Silence found themselves answering honestly for perhaps the first time in years. "I seek the right to be who I am, without apology or explanation." Merlin smiled, and for a moment, the madness seemed to clear from his features entirely. "Yes," he said simply, "that's exactly what you seek, and that's exactly what I've been seeking as well." What followed was the strangest conversation in medieval literature. A dialogue between two people who had both chosen to live as something other than what society expected them to be. Merlin had abandoned his role as a wizard to become a wild man of the woods. Silence had abandoned their assigned gender to become a knight. Both were pretending to be something they weren't. But both were also becoming something truer than what they had been before. "I'll return with you," Merlin said finally, "but not because I fear your king's justice. I'll return because you've reminded me that running from who you are never works for very long. Eventually, you have to face the truth." The journey back to court took 2 weeks, during which Merlin shared stories that would reshape Silence's understanding of identity, power, and the price of living authentically in a world that demanded conformity. He spoke of the loneliness that came with keeping secrets, the exhaustion of maintaining false personas, and the terrifying but liberating moment when you finally stop pretending to be someone else. More importantly, he began teaching Silence about the difference between deception and transformation. Lying about who you are is one thing, becoming who you're meant to be is something else entirely. As they approached the castle, both Merlin and Silence knew that their time of hiding was coming to an end. The wizard would face the king's justice for his years of abandonment. The knight would face, well, that remained to be seen. But whatever happened next, neither of them would face it alone. The great hall of King Evan's castle had never seen a gathering quite like this one. Word of Silence's successful quest had spread throughout the kingdom, drawing nobles from every corner of England to witness what many believed would be the trial of the century. On one side stood Queen Euphemie, still maintaining her accusations, despite the successful completion of what had been assumed to be an impossible task. On the other stood Silence, accompanied by the legendary Merlin himself, whose very presence seemed to charge the air with possibility. But the real drama was happening in the supernatural realm that medieval audiences understood as completely real. The personified forces of nature and nurture, those allegorical figures who had haunted Silence's dreams for years, were about to have their final confrontation. Nature, appearing to the assembled court as a beautiful woman wreathed in flowers and flowing robes, made her case first. This deception has gone on long enough. The truth of the body cannot be denied forever. Let what was born female be revealed as female, and let proper order be restored to the world. But nurture, manifesting as a stern figure in scholars' robes, carrying books and tools, countered immediately. Judge not by the flesh, but by the deeds. This person has proven their worth through action, not anatomy. They have earned their place through merit, not birthright. The debate that followed was unlike anything the medieval court had ever witnessed. These weren't just philosophical arguments. They were fundamental questions about the nature of identity itself. Was a person defined by their body or their actions, by their birth or their choices, by what society expected or what they achieved? King Evan found himself in an impossible position. If he sided with nature and revealed Silence's biological sex, he would have to execute them for fraud. If he sided with nurture and allowed the deception to continue, he would be undermining the very laws that governed inheritance and social order. That's when Merlin stepped forward with a proposal that stunned everyone present. "Let me examine this night," he said, "not with magic, but with wisdom. Let me judge not what they are, but who they have become." What followed was a public interrogation, unlike any other in medieval history. Merlin questioned Silence about their actions, their motivations, their understanding of honor and duty. He asked about their years as a minstrel, their battles as a knight, their loyalty to the crown, and their service to their fellow warriors. Every answer revealed someone who had not just lived as a man, but had embodied the highest ideals of medieval masculinity: courage, honor, loyalty, skill in arms, and the willingness to sacrifice for others. "This person," Merlin declared finally, "has proven themselves to be the finest knight in your service. They have risked their life repeatedly for the crown, shown mercy to enemies, and inspired loyalty in their comrades. If these are not the qualities that define a true man, then I no longer understand what manhood means." The court erupted in confusion. Some nobles shouted for Silence to be stripped and examined physically to determine the truth. Others demanded that their service record speak for itself. The argument grew so heated that it seemed the kingdom itself might split apart over this single question. That's when Queen Eupheme made a mistake that would cost her everything. Frustrated by the court's indecision and furious that her accusations seemed to be losing credibility, she screamed out the one thing she should never have revealed. I know this fraud is a woman because I am their mother. The silence that followed was deafening. The Queen's revelation shattered more than just Silence's carefully constructed identity. It destroyed the very foundations of royal legitimacy. If Eupheme was Silence's mother, and if Silence was indeed female, then the Queen had been living her own deception for decades. The pieces began falling into place with terrible clarity. Eupheme wasn't just Queen Eupheme. She was also the Countess Euphemie of Cornwall, Cador's wife, who had supposedly given birth to a male heir years ago. The royal marriage that had cemented political alliances, the inheritance that had passed from father to son, the very succession that had brought her to the throne. All of it was built on lies. King Evan stared at his wife with a mixture of horror and dawning understanding. You told me you had a son. You told me the Cornwall line was secure. You told me... I told you what you needed to hear, Eupheme snapped, her composure finally cracking completely. Would you have married me if you'd known I could only produce daughters? Would you have allied with Cornwall if you'd known their bloodline would end with a girl? The court watched in fascination as one of the most powerful marriages in England disintegrated before their eyes. But for Silence, standing at the center of this chaos, the personal implications were far more devastating than the political ones. Their mother, the woman who had helped create their false identity, who had supported their deception for years, had just destroyed them out of spite and sexual frustration. The parent who should have protected them had chosen revenge over family loyalty. But the cruelest irony was yet to come, because as the full truth emerged, as the court learned that Silence was indeed female, and that their entire identity had been constructed to circumvent inheritance laws, something unexpected happened. The knights who had served with Silence, the warriors who had fought beside them, the nobles who had witnessed their courage and skill, they didn't turn away in disgust. Instead, many of them stepped forward in support. I don't care what body they were born with, declared Sir Gareth, Silence's closest friend among the knights. They saved my life in battle. They've shown more honor than most men I know. If King Evan is fool enough to execute the finest knight in England over a technicality, then he's not worthy of our service. Other voices joined his. Tales of Silence's courage, their loyalty, their willingness to sacrifice for others. Stories of battles won, lives saved, honor upheld. The testimony of people who had seen Silence not as a woman pretending to be a man, but as a person who had earned their respect through actions rather than anatomy. For a moment, it seemed as though the court might choose merit over convention, character over law. For a moment, it seemed as though medieval England might embrace a radically different understanding of identity and worth. But moments of possibility are fragile things, especially when they threaten the foundations of established power. King Evan, faced with a choice between upholding the law and acknowledging the injustice of that law, chose the path that would preserve his own authority. With visible reluctance, He pronounced the sentence that everyone had been dreading. Silence would be stripped of their knighthood and forced to live as a woman. Their lands would be confiscated, and their name would be erased from the rolls of honor. It was a death sentence of the spirit, if not the body. But Silence had spent too many years fighting for the right to be themselves, to surrender now. As the guards stepped forward to escort them away, they made one final gesture of defiance that would be remembered long after the kingdoms of that era had crumbled to dust. They began to sing. The voice that rose from Silence's throat wasn't the carefully controlled masculine tone they had cultivated for years of deception. It wasn't the high, sweet soprano that medieval society would have expected from a woman. It was something else entirely, a sound that seemed to transcend gender altogether, carrying within it all the pain and triumph of a life lived authentically, despite impossible circumstances. The song they chose was one of the ancient ballads they had learned during their years as a minstrel, but the words they sang were new, composed in that moment of supreme crisis. I have lived as I was trained to live. I have fought as I was taught to fight. I have served with all the strength I have to give. I have honored what I believed was right. If my body makes my service void, if my birth negates my sacrifice, then your laws are but a tool to be employed against any who would claim their own device. Asterisk. The effect was electrifying. This wasn't just a song. It was a manifesto, a declaration of independence from a system that valued anatomy over achievement, inheritance over character. As Silence sang, their voice seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker, filling the great hall with a power that made even King Evan step back in alarm. But the most extraordinary moment came when other voices began joining in. First Sir Gareth, adding his rough bass to the melody. Then other knights, servants, even some of the nobles who had witnessed Silence's years of faithful service. The song spread through the hall like wildfire, transforming a trial into something approaching a revolution. Merlin, watching from the sidelines, with eyes that seemed to see far beyond the present moment, began to laugh. Not the mad cackle of his forest years, but the deep, satisfied laughter of someone who has just witnessed history change direction. "Your Majesty," he called out, his voice cutting through the singing, "I believe you face a choice that will define your entire reign. You can execute this night for the crime of serving you too well, or you can acknowledge that perhaps your understanding of honor and identity might be incomplete." The singing stopped abruptly, leaving the hall in a silence so complete that the crackling of torches sounded like thunder. All eyes turned to King Evan, who stood frozen between the throne and the scaffold, between tradition and transformation. What he said next would determine not just Silence's fate, but the very nature of justice in his kingdom. "I have been king for 20 years, Evan said slowly, "and in that time, I have seen many men fail the tests of knighthood. I have watched nobles born to privilege prove themselves cowards in battle. I have witnessed those with every advantage squander their opportunities through selfishness and vice." He turned to look at Silence, his expression unreadable. "And then there is you, born to circumstances that should have made knighthood impossible, yet becoming the finest warrior in my service. Raised in deception, yet showing more honor than most of my court. Living a lie in the particulars, yet embodying truth in all the ways that matter. The court held its collective breath. I cannot change the laws of inheritance, the king continued, but I can choose how to interpret the laws of honor. You have proven yourself in every test we set before you. You completed a quest that others deemed impossible. You brought back a wizard who had been lost for years. You faced accusations with courage and served your kingdom with distinction. He paused, seeming to wrestle with himself before continuing. Therefore, I declare that while you may not inherit lands or titles as a woman, you have earned them through your service as a knight. Your deeds speak louder than your birth, and your character matters more than your anatomy. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but offered everyone something. Silence would be allowed to keep their knighthood and their honor, but their true identity would be known throughout the court. They would live openly as what they had always been in secret. Someone who transcended the simple categories that medieval society used to define identity. But Queen Ufeme, faced with the exposure of her own deceptions and the failure of her revenge, made one final, desperate attempt to destroy what she could not control. She reached for the dagger at her belt, intending to end with violence what politics had failed to accomplish. She never got the chance. The blade never left its sheath. Merlin, despite his apparent madness and years of forest exile, moved with the reflexes of someone who had once been the deadliest wizard in Christendom. His gnarled hand caught Queen Eupheme's wrist before she could draw steel, and the force of his grip made her gasp in pain. "Enough," he said, and though his voice was quiet, it carried an authority that made even the king step back. "You have lost, woman. Accept your defeat with what dignity you have left." But Eupheme was beyond dignity now. Years of frustration, sexual desire, political ambition, and maternal conflict had twisted her into something barely recognizable as the woman who had once helped craft Silence's deception. She struggled against Merlin's grip, her face contorted with rage. "You don't understand," she screamed. "I created them. I made every choice that shaped who they became. They are what they are because of me, and I can unmake them just as easily." It was the final, terrible revelation of a woman who had never understood the difference between control and love. In her mind, Silence wasn't a person with their own agency and identity. They were a creation, a project, something that existed to serve her needs and desires. The recognition of this truth hit Silence like a physical blow. They had spent years believing that their mother had supported their deception out of love and family loyalty. Now they understood that she had supported it only as long as it served her purposes. The moment Silence became inconvenient, the moment they refused to satisfy her desires, she had turned them into a weapon to destroy them. "You're right," Silence said quietly, their voice cutting through Eupheme's ravings. "You did help create who I am, but you created someone stronger than you imagined, someone who could survive even your betrayal." They stepped forward, moving close enough to look directly into their mother's eyes. "You wanted a son who would preserve your legacy. Instead, you created a person who will preserve their own. You wanted someone you could control. Instead, you created someone who chose their own path. The conversation that followed was unlike any recorded exchange between parent and child in medieval literature. It was brutal in its honesty, devastating in its finality, and strangely liberating for both parties involved. Eupheme, forced to confront the reality of what she had done, slowly began to deflate. The rage that had sustained her for so long couldn't survive the cold light of recognition. She had destroyed her marriage, exposed her own deceptions, and alienated the child she had claimed to protect, all in service of desires she couldn't even articulate clearly. "I just wanted," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to matter, to be important to someone." "You were," Silence replied with surprising gentleness. "You were my mother, and I loved you despite everything. But love doesn't mean ownership, and family doesn't mean control." The reconciliation that might have followed was interrupted by a commotion at the Great Hall's entrance. Soldiers in unfamiliar colors burst through the doors, their weapons drawn and their faces grim. The political crisis within England had provided an opportunity for enemies without, and Scotland was once again moving against the northern borders. King Evan faced the same crisis that had first brought Silence to prominence. Invasion, with his finest knights scattered or compromised by the revelations of the trial. The kingdom needed its greatest warrior now more than ever. All eyes turned to Silence, who stood at the crossroads between their old life and their new identity. They could accept the king's compromise and live openly as someone who didn't fit society's categories. They could retreat from public life and find some quiet corner where their unconventional identity wouldn't matter. Or they could do what they had always done when faced with impossible choices. They could fight. The decision took less than a heartbeat. The Scottish invasion force that swept across the northern border was unlike any that had come before. These weren't raiders seeking quick plunder. They were an army bent on conquest, led by a warlord who had spent years planning the downfall of English power. King Evan's response was hampered by the chaos in his own court. Half his nobles were questioning his judgment after the Silence affair. The other half were demanding immediate action despite having no clear strategy. Worst of all, the kingdom's most effective military commander was now an openly gender non-conforming person whose very presence challenged medieval assumptions about warfare and leadership. But Silence had spent too many years proving themselves to be deterred by social awkwardness. When the War Council convened to plan England's defense, they walked into the chamber wearing full armor, their sword at their side and their head held high. "I request permission to lead the vanguard against the Scottish forces," they announced without preamble. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet of the trial. This was the silence of experienced warriors, recognizing that politics had just become irrelevant in the face of military necessity. Sir Gareth was the first to speak. "I'll serve under Silence's command," he said firmly. "I've fought beside them. I know their capabilities. Gender identity doesn't matter when the kingdom is at stake." Other voices quickly joined his. The knights who had witnessed Silence's courage, the soldiers who had served under their leadership, even some of the nobles who had initially been scandalized by the revelations. They all recognized that England's survival mattered more than social conventions. King Evan, faced with pragmatic necessity, made the decision that would define his legacy. He appointed Silence as overall military commander, making them the first openly transgender general in recorded European history. The army that marched north was unlike any that had ever taken the field. Led by someone who embodied transformation itself, it seemed to carry a different energy than traditional military forces. Soldiers who might normally have been divided by class, region, or personal loyalties found themselves united by the commander's example of living authentically despite social pressure. The first engagement came at Hadrian's Wall, where the Scottish forces had expected to break through English defenses easily. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy that fought with unusual coordination and determination. Silence's years of studying military strategy, combined with their practical experience in actual combat, had produced a tactical approach that consistently surprised and outmaneuvered the invaders. But the real test came when the armies met in open battle on the moors of Northumberland. This was no skirmish or border raid. This was a full-scale confrontation that would determine whether England remained independent or fell under Scottish rule. Silence rode at the front of the English charge, their banner streaming in the wind, their voice carrying over the chaos of battle as they called out orders and encouragement. They fought with the skill of a master warrior and the inspiration of someone who had found their true calling. The battle that followed was remembered in ballads for centuries afterward. The English victory was so complete, so decisive, that Scotland would not attempt another major invasion for a generation. But more importantly for our story, it established once and for all that Silence's identity as a knight transcended any questions about their birth or gender. When they returned to court, covered in dust and glory, even their harshest critics had to acknowledge that England owed its survival to someone who didn't fit any of society's neat categories. King Evan, greeting his returning general, spoke words that would be carved into stone and remembered long after both of them were dead. You have proven that honor knows no gender, that courage needs no permission from society, and that true nobility comes from character rather than birth. But the greatest moment of recognition came from an unexpected source. 3 months after the victory at Northumberland, as England celebrated its survival and began rebuilding from the war, a visitor arrived at King Evan's court who would change everything once more. It was Count Cador, Silence's father, who had remained in Cornwall throughout the crisis, believing his child to be dead and his deception exposed. The reunion between father and child was everything the confrontation with Euphemie had not been. Where the mother had tried to maintain control through manipulation and guilt, Cador simply embraced the person his daughter had become. "I'm proud of you," he said simply, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Not because you fooled everyone, not because you preserved our family's honor, but because you found the courage to be yourself despite impossible circumstances." It was the validation that Silence had been seeking their entire life. Acceptance not for the role they had played or the deception they had maintained, but for the person they had chosen to become. But Kador brought more than just emotional resolution. He brought a proposal that would reshape the kingdom's understanding of inheritance and identity. I petition the king, he announced formally, to recognize my child as my heir, not because of their birth gender, but because of their proven worthiness. Let merit determine succession rather than anatomy. Let the laws evolve to match the reality of human diversity. It was a revolutionary idea that struck at the heart of medieval social structure. For centuries, inheritance had been determined by rigid gender rules that assumed men were inherently more capable of leadership than women. Kador was proposing that capability should be proven rather than assumed, that identity should be recognized rather than mandated. The debate that followed would continue for years, spreading throughout medieval Europe as other kingdoms grappled with similar questions. But the precedent had been set by someone whose very existence challenged traditional categories. Merlin, who had remained at court as a trusted advisor despite his unconventional return, provided the philosophical framework that would guide these discussions. He spoke of identity as something that emerged from the interaction between nature and choice, between what we're born with and what we decide to do with our lives. Silence has shown us, he said in one of his most famous speeches, that the categories we use to define people are less important than the content of their character. They have lived as a man not because they rejected womanhood, but because manhood was the path that allowed them to express their truest self. It was a concept that wouldn't be fully understood or accepted for many centuries, but the seeds had been planted in 13th century England by someone who refused to be limited by the circumstances of their birth. As for Queen Ufem, the aftermath of her revelations and attempted violence led to a very different kind of reckoning. Stripped of her royal title and facing charges for her attack on silence, she was given a choice: face trial for attempted murder or accept exile from the kingdom. She chose exile, but not before one final conversation with the child she had both created and tried to destroy. I never understood, she said during their last meeting, how you could be so content living as something you weren't. But that's where you're wrong, Silence replied gently. I was never living as something I wasn't. I was living as exactly who I am. Someone who transcends the simple categories that society uses to define people. The exchange encapsulated the fundamental misunderstanding that had driven their conflict. Ufem had seen Silence's identity as a performance, a role being played for strategic advantage. Silence had experienced it as the expression of their authentic self, the alignment of their inner truth with their outer presentation. It was a distinction that would echo through the centuries, relevant not just to medieval questions of inheritance and gender roles, but to every person who has ever struggled to live authentically in a world that demands conformity. The manuscript that preserves Silence's story was lost for over 600 years, dismissed as unimportant documents, and forgotten in a crate at Wallerton Hall. When it was rediscovered in 1911, scholars initially focused on its literary merits and historical significance, largely overlooking its profound insights into questions of gender and identity. It would take until the late 20th century for readers to fully appreciate what Heldress of Cornwall had achieved in the 13th century, a nuanced, sympathetic, and remarkably modern exploration of what it means to live authentically when society demands that you be someone else. The story of silence resonates today, not because it provides easy answers to complex questions, but because it captures the timeless struggle between individual truth and social expectations. Every person who has ever felt like they didn't fit the categories that others tried to impose on them can find something of themselves in this medieval knight's journey. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Silence's story is that it wasn't written as a tragedy. Despite all the challenges, all the deceptions, all the moments of crisis and revelation, the narrative ultimately celebrates the triumph of living authentically. Silence doesn't end up punished for their non-conformity. They end up honored for their courage and service. That's a revolutionary message for any era, but it was especially radical in the 13th century. At a time when deviation from social norms often meant death, Heldress of Cornwall created a story that argued for acceptance, understanding, and the recognition that human diversity was a strength rather than a threat. The real victory of Silence's story isn't the battles they won or the kingdom they saved. It's the simple but profound achievement of living as themselves, openly and without apology, in a world that had no ready-made category for who they were. They created their own category, and in doing so, they created space for all the others who would follow. Everyone who would ever refuse to be limited by the circumstances of their birth. Everyone who would ever choose authenticity over acceptance. Everyone who would ever insist on the right to define themselves rather than be defined by others. In the end, that's the most heroic quest of all. The journey to become who you truly are, regardless of what the world tells you is possible. The knight known as Silence completed that quest 800 years ago. Their story deserves to be remembered not just as a curiosity from medieval literature, but as a testament to the courage it takes to live authentically in any era. They were a knight, a warrior, a minstrel, a leader, and a person who refused to be limited by the categories that others tried to impose on them. They were, in every way that mattered, exactly who they chose to be. And perhaps that's the most important lesson their story can teach us. That the courage to be yourself is the most valuable treasure any quest can discover. Remember to like this video if you found Silence's story as fascinating as I did, and subscribe for more hidden stories from history that challenge everything you thought you knew about the past. Comment below and let me know. What other forgotten figures from history would you like to see covered? Because there are so many more stories like this waiting to be rediscovered.